Israel. Tom Mutch is there with the very latest for us. Tom, hello. We haven't spoken for a while. Good afternoon to you. Obviously, the news disseminating now through Israel. What do they make of it? What is the reaction there?
So I think a lot of Israelis had actually pre-processed this. The anger for them really came when South Africa made the application to the International Court of Justice in the first place. Now, a lot of Israelis feel very much that the world is about as against them as they think it can be. And actually, people have sort of greeted this ruling not with any happiness, certainly, but I think with a certain measure of relief that the judges did not come out and say that Israel has committed genocide. Because if they had, that would be a very, very powerful statement from the international community. Remember, this is very much an international court of justice. It's every single justice is from a different country, including some very major ones. And it would have been a very, very strong statement against Israel. Instead, the judges actually sort of fudged on that very main question of whether Israel had committed any genocidal acts. What they did say was that they had been worried about some of the statements made by senior Israeli politicians very, very early on in the conflict, when the anger was still very, very fresh. Even the Israeli judge ruled with the rest of most of the rest of the court on that matter. However, I think there is a slight sigh of relief in Israel that it didn't come down harder than it did.
And what is the level of support for this continued attack on Gaza within Israel? Is there a vocal faction of opposition? Is there a feeling that nobody quite knows where Netanyahu is going or what the outcome is supposed to be or when the end will come? Or is there a feeling that the atrocities on October the 7th were so appalling, the inhumane, kind of evocation of the Holocaust was so horrific that actually this war continues to be justified? How is it split within Israel itself?
So I've been thinking a lot about this myself recently, and I would say the war is still supported by a significant majority of the population. I would say probably about 80%. I would say there are probably about 10% that are very open and vocally against the war. Either they think it's not going to help end up in a situation where there can be a lasting peace. Others believe that it could easily kill the rest of the hostages. And then there are probably about another 10% who will come up and sometimes say to me, you know what, I've got quite serious doubts about this, but I don't want to speak too widely or openly about it, because there is a very, very strong pressure within Israeli society right now to have a full-throated support of the war effort. That said, there is still an awful lot of criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, both for the way the war has been prosecuted and for the security failings that led up to October the 7th. However, despite that dislike of him personally, there isn't any kind of major voice within Israeli society calling for a radically different direction.
And so, we had that terrible day last week when the news reported, 25 deaths of serving members of the Israeli army all in one day. How is the momentum going? What is the feeling about where the attacks on Gaza are headed, and, what the strategy actually is and when this might end?
Well, that's always been one of the difficulties from the very, very start. I mean, I remember when I had an interview with an Israeli spokesperson who said that after doing the damage that was done to Gaza City, they were going to continue with ground operations in Khan Yunis and Rafah. And the question that it can be easily raised then is, well, then what happens to Gaza? How is it therefore reconstructed? How is it therefore rebuilt? Where do the people go in the meantime? And what kind of arrangements will there be to govern Gaza, both so that the people of Gaza can rebuild their lives and so that the Israelis can have the security that they say they so desperately need against further attacks like what happened on October the 7th. And so far, there's been calls from the outside for potentially, an Arab country peacekeeping force within Gaza. However, the Israelis have rejected that, saying that they want to maintain overall security control. We're still more than 100 days into this conflict, very unclear on what the end result will look like a year, 5 years, 10 years from now.
And what about Israeli manpower in terms of defence forces and the number of actual physical people available to be called up and available to serve, and the country still has to keep running? It's a tiny country, as people can never quite imagine. It's just about the size of Wales. It's very small, with a very small population. And how is the momentum and the workforce for this war to be continually provided?
Well, it's very, very interesting because often often the reservists who have been called up, they will at other times have very important jobs in society. So, for instance, a lot of people who are, for instance, tech entrepreneurs. I was just reading a Haaretz Journal article today that embedded with a brigade several weeks ago. Several of the people there were doing stuff like AI design. Other people were doing weapons development. Other people were doing web development. And there's a very, very strong sense that a lot of the best and the brightest in Israeli society are being called up, and they are the ones fighting in this war. However, at the same time, remember that a large amount of Israelis do compulsory military services between the ages of about 18 to 22. So theoretically, the country has a very, very large pool of very well-trained, both men and women, that it can call upon if it needs. Now, while those deaths that have happened, like the 25 you mentioned, are very tragic events, especially for them and their families, it's not a war where Israel is likely to run out of manpower in the same way that Ukraine, which is suffering casualties on a far higher level in its war with Russia, could in that sense.
And may I ask you one final question, which actually, if we'd been speaking just a few short weeks ago, I would have asked you first before anything else, and that is about the hostages, the Israeli hostages in Gaza, and whether there's any word, whether there's any movement or shift in bringing them home.
So actually, there have been some sort of rays of sunshine on that. The CIA, the director of the US CIA, Bill Burns, is heading to Qatar now, where he's expected to meet with the Qatari Prime Minister and the head of Mossad. And there have been some reports in Israeli press that the Hamas and Israel have come to a sort of a kind of behind-the-scenes agreement on a hostage for prisoner swap. The holdup is on the idea of a ceasefire. The Israelis have offered a couple of months, 60 days of a ceasefire. Hamas are demanding a permanent ceasefire, and the two sides are trying to come to work out whether there is any length of time that will result in all of the hostages being released. Now, we're still some ways from getting an agreement finalized, like the one that was there in November, but it does look like there has been some small breakthroughs towards that point in getting the rest of the 136 hostages home.